meaning a profoundly moral person, need not keep his word, nor does he necessarily see his action through to the end. He aims only at what is right. We know how important keeping promises is in styles of reasoning, especially under the influence of Immanuel Kant. We know how important it is to see one's action through. And yet here, the statement is that he aims only at what is right. On the surface, this may sound a little bit like situational ethic. Any situation, from your personal subjective point of view, that seems right, you should be able to do that. You can break promises, and it's not necessary for you to see your action through to the end. But this is obviously a wrong reading of this particular statement. The great man need not keep his word, nor does he necessarily see his action through to the end. He aims only at what is right. And the question of being right, or rightness, sometimes rendered as righteousness, is a fundamental question that Mencius dealt with. Perhaps the most important transmitter of the Confucian way in the classical period. Even though the rival that we'll be discussing that next week of Mencius, Xunzi, for more than a millennium, maybe 1,000 years after Confucius, had been the principal interpreter of the Confucian way. But ever since the 11th century in China, Mencius re-emerged as the most important transmitter of the Confucian way. That's why some scholars in China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam characterize what we study as the way of Confucius and Mencius. In order to understand correctly this particular statement, we need to put it in a very broad humanistic context. And I will argue that what Mencius has in mind is based upon a particular kind of human spirit, broadly defined. This particular kind of human spirit is predicated on what normally we characterize it as the thesis of the continuity of being, or the thesis of continuum, which is very much developed by Joseph Needham, a great scholar of history and civilization of China, with emphasis on the development of Chinese science. And the interpretation I'm going to follow is not just Joseph Needham's interpretation, but an interpretation of Fritz Mote, followed Joseph Needham's lead. The assumption is that if we look at the human, which is more or less a summary of some of the issues we've been exploring so far, if we look at the human project in terms of a continuous process of linking the person, a human being, an individual, to the community, to nature, and to heaven. If we look at it very broadly as a flowing stream, the person as an individual ought to be located not only in the human community, but in nature and in cosmos. I do not confuse or conflate idea of nature with heaven. When we get to the discussion of centrality and commonality, that should become clear. And the person, the development of a person in the process of continuity entails both a broadening and a deepening. And these two processes are integrated. The person finds his or her niche within a network of relationships extending from the individual to the family, to the neighborhood, even to nature and to cosmos. And there's always interplay of all these processes. In other words, we're talking about a very complex system. It's not a single, very simple system. It's a complex system with emphasis on interconnection. And in this interconnection, a great deal of boundaries have been crossed. I mentioned even the idea of the self and community cannot be simply conceived as discrete entities. They should be imagined as existence in process. One of the most important classics in the Chinese tradition is the Book of Change. Its emphasis on existence in process, the dynamic interchange between the self and community, between two individuals, between the human species and nature, between the human heart and mind and heaven. This is what Joseph Needham has characterized, he's a biologist, characterized as a kind of organismic vision. This organismic vision means that all of the parts of the entire cosmos belong to one organic whole, and that they all interact as participants in the spontaneous self-generating life process. It's a very loaded idea, but the idea is that you can imagine the whole universe, the cosmos, as self-generating, not caused by any forces from outside, self-generating life process. You imagine it as a network or net-like interweaving of events. The cosmic process in a many-sided fashion affect human life within it, because we are all active elements, active participants in this process. And this background is to say the decisions we make as ordinary individuals are not simply moral decisions. They also have broad cosmic consequences. We're all interconnected in this particular fashion. The important moral question for the Confucians at the time of Mencius, assuming this is the cosmological background of Mencius' moral thinking, is how can we find a niche in this very fluid situation? How will we be able to make the right judgment in this very fluid situation? This requires, of course, not only a sense of our proper niche, but also a sense of direction. Mencius assumed, based upon his understanding of the Confucian message, that humanity, the idea of sympathy and empathy, humanity, is the proper human abode, in the sense, it's the proper place for us to find ourselves. Sympathy actually helps us to find a proper niche in the world. The world in which we live is not simply a world of alienation, but a world of sympathetic resonances of all these life forces. Of course, it's an option. But the important thing also, not just to find a niche, but also to find a path, a proper path for humans. And the proper path is the path of rightness, is the path of righteousness. Now we can perhaps, this is a conjecture on my part, we can perhaps locate the idea of rightness in terms of the interplay between humanity on the one hand and ritual on the other. We've argued earlier in the Confucian conception is that inner sympathy or inner morality needs to be manifested in a proper form, so we can develop a civilized mode of life by interacting with other human beings with a proper form. The proper form is ritual, and inner morality is humanity. But there is tension between sympathy or inner morality and a particular form. the form may not be appropriate to the situation. The form may become too rigid. The form may become formalistic. The form may become constraining. It's simply an imposition. Try to follow the ritual with no actual feeling involved. So in this particular sense, a judgment is needed. A judgment to see how my inner feeling of sympathy can be expressed based upon a particular form which is fitting to that particular sense. A fitting judgment must be fair and appropriate. Now, is this situational ethic? Is this something that based upon my own sense of what is right, what is wrong? If we imagine the person as a totally isolated individual, only my thinking heart, reflecting mind is going to be the judge, then we can derive this particular idea of the proper judgment from simply my thinking self. So what I deem to be appropriate is appropriate. But that's not a Confucian option. If you use Finger-Red's idea, it's not even a rejected possibility. The Confucians never anticipate that as the proper way. Individualistic judgment based upon a particular situation that one deems fit for one's own situation. Because the person is a network of relationships, linking not only to other persons, but linking to nature, linking to heaven. It's a complex system in which you locate yourself. So you cannot say what I feel at the time is the most appropriate. If what you feel at the time is not necessarily the most appropriate, then the argument is that we need to cultivate a moral sense. We need to cultivate a moral sense so what we decide will be appropriate. By the judgment of the community, the best sense of the judgment of the community, not just convention, even by the relationship between us and heaven on the one hand and nature on the other. And this moral sense is predicated on a decision, what Mencius would call the power of the will. We have to exercise the power of the will to decide what is appropriate. And that decision, use a modern expression, is an existential decision. It's not a simple decision. It's an existential decision, which means the decision entails an action. The decision itself is not just thinking, it is also acting. Numerous decisions do not necessarily lead to concrete action. But this particular kind of decision must lead to concrete action, lead to concrete evidence, and will be consequential in terms of one's life. And this decision is not an either-or decision, like you have to choose at the crossroads. It's a decision that is not only either-or, but both and. If we have to, sometimes we have to break a promise. We don't have to see our action through. It is because in our judgment, to keep promise may turn out to be even more devastating than to abandon it. If I promise to lend some money to a friend and realizing the person is going to use it for gambling, and I exercise the judgment, or for drug, I exercise the judgment and not keep the promise of lending the money, because I think in that situation it's much better for me not to do it. And this decision is made not because my own promise is at stake, but also the well-being of my friend and my relationship to my friend is also at stake. And of course, my sense of the well-being of the community and even some other issues. So I have to make a critical judgment at that moment. And that critical judgment is the optimization of many, many factors. It is not just a simple either-or choice. Optimization in the sense that in a finite system, all the factors, all the conditions, to the best of my knowledge, have already been considered, and this may be the best course of action to take. Now, Mencius made a distinction which is very easy to understand, but it's very critical. Made a distinction between the great body and the small body. First of all, he observes that the distinction between being human and being other members of the animal kingdom is infinitesimal. In a sense, it's very small. The difference between a human being and other animals is very small. But that tiny difference is the basis for the development of the great body. The small body, by comparison, is all the instinctual demands that we share with other members of the animal kingdom, specifically sex, appetite, but all kinds of other instinctual demands, even aggressiveness and all kinds of things. So we are animals, 99%. But there's one tiny difference between being human and being ordinary animal. And that tiny difference is the basis for the development of the great body. And that tiny difference, because the tiny difference can make us as human beings great, whereas all the instinctual demands that we share with other animals simply define us as merely human. All these other instinctual demands turn out to be exclusive and excluding. You satisfy one desire, you have to sacrifice some other desires. And many of these desires are in conflict, and most of the desires cannot be satisfied. And insatiable demands. And they make us small because the more we try to express ourselves in terms of these desires, the more we run into conflict and tension with other human beings, and the human species as a whole with nature, and human heart and mind with heaven. So in that sense, even though 99% of the instinctual demands we share with other animals, these are biological realities, but if we allow them to take control of us completely, we become belittled. We become trivialized. We no longer are capable of linking meaningfully in long-term perspective with an ever-extending network of relationships. And yet, the great body, which is the tiny aspect of us which differentiates us from other animals, gradually can be accommodating and can incorporate of all our instinctual demands in a harmonious, integrated fashion. In other words, the small body cannot accommodate the great body, even though we can be very much defined 99% in terms of these instinctual demands. And the great body, even though it's tiny in terms of our distinction from other animals, but if it's cultivated, it will eventually be able to harmonize our instinctual demands, will be satisfied in this sense, satisfied in terms of sex and appetite, but will be able to satisfy many other demands, and the other instinctual demands, as well as other kind of aspirations that cannot be reduced to instinctual demands. So this sense of the great body and the small body is based upon the mentioned idea that the great body is the human heart and mind. And the human heart and mind is defined in terms of the feeling of commiseration. Here, Mencius, more than any other Confucian thinkers, introduce the notion of shame. I would say even shame and guilt as an integral part of the style of moral reasoning. Shame occurs not because of public image. It occurs because of an internal sense of the guilt, of the gap between what we are and what we ought to be. There's always a gap. The gap can be greatly widened can be narrowed, but there's always a gap. The gap can never be fully reached. But the gap between what we are and what we ought to be gives us a sense of aspiration. We want to struggle to become better than we are. This is, in a way, very much like the Christian idea of the original sin. The Christian idea is based upon separation between ourselves and our Creator. The idea of God. We move away from God, from God's grace. But in the Confucian tradition, there's nothing like the myth of the fall. Since there's no myth of the fall, there's no original sin. There's no original separation. Originally, we are integral part of the cosmos. Not only integral part of the cosmos, we are co-creators of the cosmos through our own self-actualization. In fact, the idea that a human being can, through one's self-effort, but self-effort not simply as an individualistic act, but as a communal act, will be able to improve oneself, provides both a justification, I would say even an ultimate justification, and an actual process of self-development. The assumption is we can actually improve ourselves by mobilizing internal resources that we originally have, not by depending upon external forces. Now, the paradox is we have to be critically aware of all the external forces, social, political, not to mention economic, but even environmental, that are important in shaping our form of life. We have to be critically aware of these forces to make the critical judgment. Being aware of these forces is not to undermine our internal ability to make a decision. And that decision as a judgment can become a transformative act. So despite all the structural limitations, I mentioned quite a few of them, there is the possibility of self-transformation. The ultimate justification for this self-transformation is not a transcendent God, it's not social convention, not any kind of other forces outside of ourselves. It's totally self-generating. But the self-generating forces is dependent upon the power of the will. Now, in the Analects, Confucius said you could actually remove the commander of the three armies, but you cannot destroy the willpower even of a farmer. When a farmer decides to do something internally, that will cannot be destroyed. That internal will is linked to a person's sense of dignity, personal dignity. Now, Mencius gave a very interesting observation now. If you encounter a beggar who's starving, and if you present the food to the beggar in a manner that is totally inappropriate, for example, Mencius said, "Here, just eat it, you're dying." The beggar, though starving, may choose not to accept it because he's being insulted. And this happens all the time. The people in the most difficult situation, when there's no show of respect whatsoever, and as if to allow the person to live is all the benefit that we'll be able to shower upon the person. And that may turn out to be a total misjudgment of the human condition. A human being may choose even starvation or poverty because the dignity is being insulted. Now that is an indication, a very common indication, that even the person who is in the worst possible situation, the person's self-worth or dignity is still being preserved. Therefore, the person has a sense of shame, and that sense of shame, if cultivated, can become a very powerful force for social transformation. And this is autonomous morality rather than heteronymous. In other words, morality based upon internal decision rather than morality based upon external conditions. There are some very powerful assumptions that how this actually works. The first assumption is that every human being, from the mentioned point of view, is endowed with many germs or buds, sprouts of humanity. And these germs, sprouts, or buds of humanity, especially 4 of them, define what a human being really is in the most basic sense. Humanity, rightness, respect or propriety, or the knowing capacity, especially the capacity to distinguish good from evil, these are internal. Now, on the surface, this seems outrageous, but I think there is a very important reason why Mencius argues according to this manner. Mencius, of course, says the human nature is good, but don't simply accept it as a naive, optimistic assertion about human self-transformation. There's a profound reason why Mencius simply states that human nature is good. The reason is because every human being, no matter how depraved, is still endowed with rich, potentially rich inner resources for self-transformation. Humanity, respect and propriety, knowing capacity, and of course rightness, from the mentioned point of view, are internal. They're not external. You have to learn this. It is required. You have to learn, but the sprouts, the buds, the germs are internally generated. But they must grow, otherwise they may die. But even if they become totally relegated to the background, they can always be revitalized through the act of willing. This is a rather interesting assumption. In behavioral terms, we can see a person has no willpower whatsoever, incapable of making the right decision. There's no sympathy left. Even in that situation, Mencius would consider that revitalization is always possible. Now, Mencius also recognized there is only a small group of people who can be enlightened just by themselves, not being provoked, not being challenged from outside. In fact, in a paradoxical way, you can say that Mencius is very much of an environmentalist. He's not an environmental determinist, he's an environmentalist. People who are brought up in the state of Chu will always use the language of the state of Chu. It's very difficult for the people who were brought up in the state of Chu to learn the language of Qi. People who were brought up in English, it would be very difficult to learn another language. And that is very much a constraining effect of the environment. In the period of poverty, people can turn out to be callous, insensitive. In the period of affluence, people become lazy. People will not work very hard. All these conditions from outside, the mountain of Niu, the Bu Mountain near the city used to be with all kinds of trees, but now it's totally denuded. And the life force of the mountain is still there. So environment is absolutely critical for shaping the life of each one of us. But in the ultimate choice, no matter how bad the environment is, if you look at it from a personalistic point of view, 2 positions from the Confucian perspective need to be maintained. One position is to say, no matter how bad I am, I do not give myself the right to remain as I am. It's a personal position. So there's always room for improvement. When I look at the situation, in terms of my own condition. And yet, I cannot judge someone else according to the measure that I judge myself. I have to say, no matter how bad the situation is, I'm trying to improve. I should and ought to try to improve myself. And at the same time, in trying to understand other person, I cannot prejudge the condition. In other words, toward the others, we should be considerate. Towards ourselves, we have to be honest in the sense of exacting. To push oneself to become better is a precondition for self-improvement, which is not at all in conflict with considerateness towards others. So judging my own situation, when you ask the question, well, if the situation is so bad, all the environmental forces there, how can we expect someone to do A, B, C? In that situation, you can show tremendous sympathy and considerateness. Maybe under that kind of situation, it's difficult for us to expect anything out of that situation. But if you look at your own self in the concrete, can you allow yourself the following proposition, that is, because I know that I've been so much conditioned by all these negative forces in the environment, I'm so much overcome, and it is my right to just remain as I am, not to improve myself, because I have objectively analyzed the situation and arrived at a conclusion that it is simply right for me not to improve myself. That position is never allowed in the Confucian context. But there is realistic awareness that overwhelming majority of the people may not share the same kind of insight. So the fascinating thing is, it is totally universal in the sense every human being is capable of doing it. And realistically speaking, an overwhelming majority of the people may not necessarily share. And yet, I cannot allow myself to say, because overwhelming majority of people do not necessarily share this insight, my own quest for self-improvement is therefore totally unrealistic or totally meaningless. Now, the underlying assumption is that the way to improve society clearly was to bring to its service the best, the most enlightened, the most self-reflective among its latent human resources. So you look at the world, trying to understand yourself in reference to many other human beings, there is even a pragmatic consideration. It's not idealistic consideration, what ought to be done. We know that the time of Mencius was not a time of peace, not a time of order, but a time of progressive militarization of society in the period. Great deal of wars, great deal of violence. And Mencius was extremely sensitive to the people's sufferings. And the people's sufferings always caused by insensitive rulers, callous, insensitive rulers. And the insensitive rulers turned out to be those who were powerful, influential. Those were the elite. Those turned out to be people like us, somewhat aware of the total situation. Those were the people who had a tremendous influence upon the rest of humanity. Because of violence and disorder often were done by evils of government. And of course, governments by force. So Mencius was basically a populist. Populist is to assume that every human being has this potential of being a co-creator of the universe. Every human being, no exception. And yet the situation of the time, Mencius' time is called warring states. All this conflict and tension clearly indicate that the world is degenerating. Brute force was the rule of the game, and the power relationships at the time was such that all these moral idealism cannot be clearly demonstrated as the lived reality of the people. People just suffered all the time. He then devoted himself to the task of cultivating a class of the enlightened, class of people who were not directly involved in agriculture, in industry, in commerce, or even in government. These were the intellectuals. He devoted himself to the cultivation of a class of intellectuals who were not involved in productivity, and yet considered these people, of course himself included, are endowed with a major mission to humanize society. To try to humanize society, even though we're not involved in the productivity. We're not helping the people by providing them with food. We're not helping the people by providing them with manufactured goods or as merchants for exchange of goods. And they are brutalized by the rulers. And yet, there's a niche that people like us should be able to perform. That niche, from the Mencius point of view, is the niche for those who labor with their minds. They're not laboring with their muscles, but they labor with their minds. Now, they labor with their minds, they ought to be leaders, but they are not leaders in the political arena. Because they did not and ought not help the kings to brutalize the people. They shouldn't simply serve as advisors to the kings to devise mechanisms of economic development or political control or military might. They should always be align themselves with the well-being of the people. And they should be critical of the current events of the kings. They use all the resources they could mobilize to change the situation. There are all kinds of resources they could mobilize. One type of resources turned out to be symbolic resources. These symbolic resources to say, look, you may appear to be a king, but in effect, your behavior seems to show you're just a tyrant. A tyrant is not a king. Tyrannicide, to kill a tyrant, is justified. Therefore, Mencius developed this rebellious idea, or this revolutionary idea, that it's possible for the people to depose the particular ruler. And heaven will sanction that. Heaven sees as the people see, heaven hears as the people hear. So in a way, he was trying to empower the people with a certain kind of judgment about their own well-being in becoming at least rebellious, if not totally revolutionary towards the status quo. Then he argued, this is of course a statement about himself, about his followers, about those who consider themselves this is a mission to humanize the world. That these people, he made it very explicit, this profound person could not be corrupted by wealth, subdued by power, or affected by poverty. In a sense, a small class of people, the very fact that such a small class of people existed was profoundly meaningful for the society as a whole. A group of people who did not simply function in the sense of trying to maximize their own self-interest. They function as intermediaries, as messengers for a greater social ideal which is totally corrupted, which can, on the surface, cannot be rescued. And yet they could function in that particular manner. So what Mencius was trying to do is to follow the Confucian idea of the knight of the way, like the knight of the round table. You become the knight of the way, or sometimes the minister of the moral order. Your responsibility, in a curious way, your responsibility is for the enhancement of humanity as both social capital and cultural competence. So Mencius' strategy for social reform was to change the language of profit, self-interest, wealth, and power into a moral discourse with emphasis on rightness in particular, public spiritedness, welfare, especially well-being of the people, and exemplary authority. The reason why he spent all this time discussing all these issues with kings with rulers is not because he had a tremendous respect for these kings. In fact, he has tremendous contempt for many of these kings. But he had to talk to them. He had to involve himself in that process, but because these people turned out to be the sources of agony of the whole society. It's a realistic understanding how the society was ruled and controlled by these people. Now, Mencius may turn out to be too idealistic because he really wanted to get to the heart of these rulers, not just simply to persuade them by showing them he could be better in trying to develop a strategy for national defense, for economic advancement, and so forth. But he wanted to get to the heart of the people and arguing precisely that every human being is capable of. The heart of the people is to see whether these totally corrupt kings themselves still have a trace of humanity, or trace of sympathy, or trace of self-understanding. And in this sense, Mencius believed, and there's no option, not that Mencius is so naive, he didn't know all these other options. Mencius believed that the moral community is really practicable. This group of people, when they discussed these issues and following the Confucian way, felt these were the wandering knights, wandering around. They're not necessarily government bureaucrats, not merchants, not farmers. They wander around and believed that there was a function that it could perform. You can even read Mencius, try to do this, read Mencius as a special pleading for a class of people, I can call them Confucian intellectuals, or the Knights of the Way, who still believe in the warring states where everything was very much controlled by brute force, still the highest Confucian ideal of human self-realization, of the development of the moral community, is practicable. In other words, he was following an interesting Confucian dictum. I know that it cannot be done, and yet I cannot but do it. This Confucian dictum, of course, is described by one of Confucius' admirers. I know that it cannot be done is a clear description that as a single individual, even with the fellowship of the Confucians together, the overall power of transforming society is limited. You cannot change the rules of the game defined in terms of power and money into a moral community. You just cannot do that. Realistically, you know that cannot be done. And yet, you cannot but do it. In a sense, it is based upon an articulation of faith. There is a kind of Confucian faith. The Confucian faith is the faith in the transformability of the human condition through self-effort. And so if this group of people change the language, the assumptions, if they change the language, they at least develop a new possibility of understanding the world according to new conceptual apparatuses, new ideas, therefore eventually would lead to new action. So their commitment to education, in a long-term perspective, is a commitment based upon their own faith. So in this sense, that Mencius believed that benevolent government can actually be realized. Now, the benevolent government is based upon the interchange of symbolic resonances. There's a marvelous example of that. Whether it's totally imagined or actually was a clear event, we're not sure. When they encounter one of the most powerful kings, and the king said, well, there's no way that I can accept any of your idea about benevolent government. And Mencius said, look, there's something curious about you that gives me faith, gives me hope. Because when there was a ritual in the state, and a cow is supposed to be sacrificed, and yet in front of all these ministers, you decided to let the cow go and exchange a lamb for the sacrifice. Did that happen? The king said, yeah, it did happen. Now, why you decided to let the cow go? Well, the king said, because the cow was shivering with all kinds, sense of fear and trembling. I couldn't bear the thought of this cow being sacrificed, so let the cow go. Now, Mencius tried to show that the possibility of the king's sympathetic understanding of the predicament of the cow is the heart, what he would call the heart of humanity. If that heart of the humanity can be extended, humane government is not at all impossible. Now, this is a demonstration of what Mencius was trying to do in his persuasion with the king, sharply contrasted with an earlier phase, when a legalist, a very powerful legalist, first tried to persuade the king with the idea of moral excellence. The king fell asleep. So he decided to talk about economic profit. The king became interested. When he decided to talk about military might, the king became very excited. They talked for about 3 days. So these intellectuals at the time were quite aware of the symbolic resources they could control. They could help the king to follow the dictates of the state in terms of the quest for wealth and power, or they could fight against it. To fight against it is not going to bring any concrete good in a short run, but to fight against it is dictated by a commitment to a sense of moral community. In the long run, actually, what actually happened was fascinating, because in the long run, what Mencius was able to do was to precisely to develop a new language of understanding politics. And that new language, based upon the symbolic power of transforming politics into a discourse on human flourishing. That became the idealistic, became kind of an idealistic, at the same time pragmatic concern of the Confucians. And unfortunately, what Mencius tried to do at the time was somewhat short-lived. And the power of the legalistic persuasion based upon wealth and military mind triumphed. But in the long run, it's very difficult to say what Mencius did was total failure, because what Mencius considered important turned out to be not only a new way of looking at politics at the central government, but in terms of the formation of an educated class of people, increasingly enlarging that repertoire in staffing the bureaucracy. And once that is done, you can see the emergence of two forces in Chinese history. One is the moralization of politics, which may never be totally successful. The other one is the politicization of the moral community for socio-political control. Thank you.